Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to share some ideas with you today. First, similar to Abi's remarks, I want to thank the organizing committee for putting this together and for inviting me. I'm very grateful. I'm also grateful to you for giving me your most precious resource, which is your time. The older I get, I'm realizing how that's the one resource we give people we can never get back. And so I hope to make this count because you're not getting the time back. Sorry. I teach a course to MBA students, and one of the things I always do is give them quotes from people way smarter than me, so that at the end of the semester, they cannot say, we didn't get anything from this course. You at least got a few quotes. So I'm going to start with this one, and the thing that I'd love for you to take is really the last comment, that the entrepreneur in many of the markets we serve, right, we're talking about Africa and Asia, must not just create, but must also create the conditions to create. And so when we think about investing in these entrepreneurs, we're not only investing in them to build products and services, we're actually investing in them to create the conditions that enable future entrepreneurs build. I hope that by the end of this morning, you get a much deeper appreciation for the work that you do, and quite frankly, for how I regard the work you do. I think it's arguably the most important thing we can do in countries that are not yet wealthy. And I hope to make the case for why. Just 3 ideas. I'm going to start with context. I always like to start with context. It's like going to a doctor and walking in with the doctor saying, take these pills, you'll feel better. If the doctor doesn't know what's wrong, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's start with context. And I'll share some foundational ideas that kind of ground our thinking, and then venture capital. I'll end with venture capital. So, context. If you look over the past decade, many of the poorest countries have not done so well. In fact, if you look at what's going on in global development, as was mentioned, you sort of get a sense that things are not quite going in the right direction, which underscores the importance of what many of you do in this room. I also like to just give a sense for comparisons. I took the most populous African country and the most populous Asian country, and just sharing some data compared with a high-income country, the US, a middle-income country, Mexico. And you start to see some differences. Some of the things I want to highlight, if you look at how much money the US government has to spend every year per person, it's about $30,000. It's really easy math. Just take the budget divided by the number of people. If you look at what Nigeria has, it's a different story. If you look at what India has, it's a different story. Now, these funds essentially fund everything: education, healthcare, infrastructure, roads, bridges, everything. And so the questions that I begin to ask when you just look at the context is, how does a country like Nigeria build the kinds of infrastructures and institutions, public bureaucracies that can help the country flourish when the government spends roughly a couple $100 a year? It's a question. You look at some of the other demographics, some of the other data. the percent of people in the formal economy versus what I like to call the independent economy. That has huge implications on your tax base, huge implications on who has access to government services, and so on. These things help us understand the context. Look at how much credit is available per person in the country. Okay, so just setting the stage for context. The other thing that many of you may not realize is that you are not real. Like maybe you pinch yourself, but we are unicorns. You can go to the Pew Research Center website and take this. It's a fill out a quick form, and you'll get a sense for where you fall in terms of the global middle class. So 93% of people globally, right, live on less than $50 a day. You do the math, $18,250 a year. So we are unicorns, many of us in this room. If you look at the income distribution, the vast majority in the world, at least in South Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, live on less than $10 a day, it's $300 a month. Yeah. So when I think about entrepreneurship, I think about innovation, I think about transformation. These are the people I'm thinking about. When I see the videos that we just watched and the impact that that's having, it's having impact on people who have a very difficult time consuming the products and services that they need to help them lead a better life. Again, still setting the stage. And this underscores the importance of what we do here. I love this quote from Lawrence Rockefeller, who was one of the pioneering venture capitalists in the US. And yes, he is, I think, the grandson of J.D. Rockefeller, and talks about how venture capital, it's not for the impatient or the faint of heart or the poor loser. It's not for people who cannot afford to lose. And what I often remind people in rooms like this is we have already won, like all of us in this room. Like there's no version of the world where you lose. So you lose your job, so the investment doesn't go well. Life's gonna be tough for a few months, maybe a year. But there is no version of your life where you or I go down to where we're earning $300 a month. So this is really a message for us, right? We are the ones who kind of have to make these investments, or making these investments, and we can't lose because we've already won in life. That's important because when we begin to look at the work we're doing, venture capital in what I like to call growth markets, you start to see why it's important. So if you look at productivity, just the average sub-Saharan African country, South Asian country, compared to a high-income country, this is what you get. 7-8% as productive. These are the countries that we're putting capital into. If you then go into many of these countries and say, okay, what kind of companies are we investing in? You start to see a difference as well in the productivity of the countries, of the companies within those countries. And so the average MSME in Nigeria is 12% as productive as the average large company in Nigeria. It's roughly 60% in the US. Now, if we slow down and think about this, it makes quite a bit of sense. Remember some of those numbers from the start. If the US governments in high-income countries are spending $20, $30, $40,000 per person on infrastructure and healthcare, electricity, all those things that make an economy productive, and then the average in Nigeria or India is 200, 700, you start to see how hard it is for entrepreneurs. And many of the companies that you're investing in are actually not only making other companies more productive, but they're making the economies more productive. One of the reasons I believe what you do is perhaps the most important thing that we can do and get right for development to happen, sustainable development. My hope is to convince you that it is the most important thing after we're done. So that sets the stage for context. The next, I want to share some foundational ideas. Now, I got the great pleasure of my life to study under Professor Clay Christensen. Clay unfortunately passed away January 2020, but if you've ever heard the term disruptive innovation, job to be done, these were theories that he developed. The way he built his career was in trying to understand phenomena. And then he would develop theories, and then he would say, if you put those theories on, whether you're an entrepreneur, an investor, a manager, if you put those theories on as a set of lenses, it helps you make sense of the world. It's sort of like understanding, say, gravity. Once we understand it, then we can begin to manipulate it. We can begin to figure out how to work with it. And so Clay did this for a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship theories. He had the chance to work with Andy Grove on some projects decades ago that helped Intel actually develop some disruptive products. If you remember the Intel Celeron processors, I don't know if that was one of the things he helped them develop to fend off a threat from some upstarts. But the key point here is, if we understand some foundational theories, I think it helps make our lives a lot easier. And so I'd love to share a few with you, and then we'll end with venture capital. The first is the relationship between this notion of struggle, consumption, and economic activity. So with consumption, I really just mean when you purchase something, a product or a service that helps you overcome a struggle. So if you think about life, from the minute you wake up, really the minute you're born, but from the minute you wake up until you go to bed, life is nothing more than a series of struggles. And these series of struggles are marked by consumption events or non-consumption events. It's really not more complicated than that. So, hunger, these are just some examples. Housing, you get ill, clothing, transportation, you need to go from point A to point B. These struggles come up in our lives. And the minute they come up, we are looking for something to consume. We're looking for something to consume. And everything we do in the economy is really in service of consumption. Everything we do in the economy, it's in service of consumption. Now, it may sound flimsy or shallow, but again, I'd love for you to take this very simple idea and apply it to the billions of people who cannot easily consume. The entrepreneur who cannot take a credit card payment because they don't have the infrastructure. The mother whose child gets sick, who cannot consume affordable health care because they don't make enough. Now, again, many of us in this room, we consume easily. If I get a headache right now, I consume a headache medication. If I'm hungry, I consume food. Consumption for me is like breathing. For the vast majority of people in the world, consumption is really hard. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is fuel consumption. It's help people get access to the things that can relieve their struggle. Because this is guaranteed. From the minute you wake up in the morning, it is guaranteed that you will encounter struggle. You will have needs, you will have desires. What is not guaranteed for most people is whether or not they consume. And so in the work we do, we've developed a framework that sort of helps us think through how you create markets that can catalyze consumption. At the core of what we're trying to do is struggle. Right? We are trying to relieve struggle. If the entrepreneur is really not solving struggle, then they're not going to be successful. Entrepreneurs develop solutions to these struggles. In wealthy countries, in countries where governments spend a lot of money to build the infrastructure, most entrepreneurs can focus on developing solutions to struggles. It turns out in Africa and Asia, not the case. Those entrepreneurs exist within an ecosystem. Suppliers, partners, they get talent from the educational institutions, access to capital. They exist within an ecosystem that is not yet quite as developed. And so as these entrepreneurs are working to develop solutions to relieve the struggles, they're also having to contend with these ecosystems. And then those ecosystems exist within the context of countries, cities, states, regional blocks that also have struggles. If Nigeria goes to the capital markets to borrow money, it's borrowing at a much higher interest rate than Norway. Again, access to infrastructure, access to talent, education, social services, credit. All those things impact how the entrepreneur is able to develop solutions to relieve struggles. And so this is essentially why Tarun Khanna says the entrepreneur in these growth markets cannot just create, but must create the conditions to create. So a lot of your entrepreneurs are most likely building ecosystems. They start out to be a tech company that wants to improve payments, but then they're evolving into some kind of agency banking thing. And it's like, why are you doing that? Well, here's why. They don't have the luxury. Much of my work in the last book we published with Professor Christensen is on market creating innovations. These are innovations that transform complicated and expensive products and make them simple and affordable. And some market creating companies are actually in the room today. I know the Investors Ventures platform invests in these types of companies across Africa. If we look at what market creating innovators do, they create solutions that resolve struggles, but then they also solve problems that are at the ecosystem level and often at the country level. So you take an example like Max. Max provides electric vehicles, two-wheelers and three-wheelers for people in Nigeria. Now, if you look at the per capita miles driven per person, right, per capita miles driven, say you take the US, you're looking at roughly 10,000 a year. You go to a country like Nigeria, it's really hard to find the data, but somewhere around maybe 100, 200. And you look at that delta and say, how much more economic activity can we generate if you had Nigeria's miles driven go from 200 miles per person per year to 500 to 1,000? Think about the infrastructure that would support the economic activity. And so Max is making this affordable to the average person in Nigeria. But to do this, they can't just set up a dealership and say, come and purchase a vehicle. Go get financing from your bank and come purchase a vehicle. They have to build the entire ecosystem that supports the average person coming in to purchase a vehicle. Sunfi is another company here making essentially kilowatt hours affordable and accessible. And if you simply do the math on kilowatt hour per capita in wealthy countries versus Nigeria, you start to see huge gaps. But to solve that challenge, you can't just purchase a bunch of solar panels and put them in a store and expect people to come. You have to build the entire ecosystem. I can go on and on and on, but perhaps the most visceral example, the one I think I even take for granted today, is the example in all our pockets, the mobile phone. You go to any African country, any South Asian country, 25 years ago and say, I want to make this affordable and available to the average person in this country, and people would have laughed at you. Indeed, people did laugh at these entrepreneurs. But in addition to solving the struggle, they built an ecosystem and had to work with the government. This is the power of market creation. It's the power of what all of you do in this room. To do this, though, we have to sort of understand how it works. There are three main phases of market creation. The first phase is discovery, and I think a lot of low and middle income countries live in the discovery phase. You know, discovery is when an entrepreneur or a micro entrepreneur makes a product or service affordable to a few people. It's incredibly expensive. And so only the wealthy in society have access to it. And so access really goes from 0 to 1, or 0 to a few. And then the next phase is distribution. Distribution happens when you have what we call ecosystem entrepreneurs or market creating entrepreneurs come in and they figure out ways to make the product or service affordable to many more people. So access goes from one to many. And really, this is really at the core of many societies' development. It's this distribution. This is where mass consumption happens, mass distribution, mass marketing, mass production happens at this stage. Distribution funds a lot of our infrastructure, funds a lot of our public services, and so on. And it also funds the last stage, which is democratization. Now, we are all part of the global development establishment, and in democratization, you essentially go from many to all, from an access standpoint. So there becomes a product or a service, a resource, that either development experts, politicians, bureaucrats say, this needs to be a human right. Everyone needs to have access to this. Whether it's education, healthcare, internet, electricity. And so we develop programs. Whether it's a rural electrification program, universal basic education, universal healthcare programs, we develop these. And so there are very many across, Africa, many other countries that are not yet wealthy. The problem is we can't get democratization to work without distribution. Distribution effectively pays for democratization and helps us fund new discoveries. And so no matter how many universal basic programs we create, access for all, it's going to be very hard to get those to work if the work we do in this room is not successful. Here's some ideas on accelerating market creation. I'll go quickly here, and then I'll end on how I think about venture capital. I really try to simplify a lot of the frameworks and theories. And this is from some research that a colleague of mine did. He looked at over 100 innovations and said, which are the ones that diffuse really fast, where people get access to the products or service really fast in the market? And he said, if you make it easy to buy and easy to sell, diffusion can happen fast. And then he came up with 5 metrics for each that make a product easy to buy and sell. So it doesn't require space, it doesn't require time, if it doesn't require learning a new skill or a new behavior, it doesn't require help, it doesn't require additional money, it becomes easy to buy. This doesn't necessarily mean you just have to force fit your product or service into these categories, but it just gives you an idea of how fast or slow diffusion might happen, so you can plan better. So if you're working with an entrepreneur who has a product that's important, but it requires space, you have an idea maybe diffusion will not happen as fast. Or that entrepreneur needs to think about the consumers and how they will manage the space constraint. On the producer side, if you make it easy to sell, this is essentially making it easy to have partners and suppliers. And so you don't need to build an entirely new infrastructure. So why is electrifying our economies difficult, at least from a mobility standpoint? Well, you can't just, charge up your electric vehicles in a gas station. We need new infrastructure. So that's impacting the diffusion curve. If your partners don't need entirely new processes and new systems, diffusion happens faster. If there are network effects, diffusion happens faster. And so these are ideas that help us accelerate diffusion. Last couple slides, venture capital. I was preparing for a presentation last year on venture capital, and this occurred to me. And I think this is what convinced me that venture capital is the single most important financial vehicle an economy can absorb. I do have an MBA, but I can barely spell finance. So what I do know is you have different financial vehicles, and a financial vehicle is associated with risk. It's very simple. When you actually look at the different financial vehicles that flow through an economy, it turns out the riskiest vehicle is venture capital. That's the vehicle that goes out into the economy and makes order out of chaos. I mean, many of you are doing this. You think about what your companies do. You make order out of chaos, and all of a sudden, the economy begins to be a little bit more systematized. It begins to be a little more formalized. Folks now start paying taxes. Folks have records. We have income statements. We can make sense out of this innovation and entrepreneurship. And in so doing, yes, you de-risk the investment for the private equity folks, for the strategic acquisition folks, for the public markets, but you really are also de-risking the economy. Because the reason America is able to borrow at minuscule interest rates is not because people just love the way Americans look. It's because you have companies within the country that are creating value, that are being taxed, and the American government says, I'll pay back on time. The more we do that, the more our work funds that, the easier it becomes for India to borrow, for Nigeria to borrow, for Sri Lanka, for Bangladesh. And so on the one hand, I mean, I hope this every day. I hope the Nigerian government and the Kenyan government and the Indian government, they wake up and there's no corruption and that things work fast and the bureaucracy is more efficient. I hope that. But then as a researcher, I put on my sort of scientific hat on, and I'm like, well, the chances of that happening are very low, but this gets us there. So I know you invest in startups, but you really are building these countries. And if you don't succeed, I don't know how many of these countries succeed. Last thing I want to say, because venture capital is sort of the topic of conversation, is there's a really good book called VC, An American History, written by Tom Nicholas. And he talks about the history of venture capital. And much of what we interface with today, we consume, we touch, it has evolved over time. And so if you just look at the history of venture capital, you start to see some interesting things. First of all, in the 1700s, you had a lot of folks put money together to send ship captains out to go look for whale oil. And if you chart the returns from the ship captains against venture capital returns, they're almost identical. And so that's sort of where this idea of venture capital came from. But then you had the Industrial Revolution happen, and then a ton of people made a ton of money, and they were like, what are we going to do with all this money? And then you had them come together and say, let's pool this resource together, let's formalize it, and they created the Uniform Limited Partnership Act. And much of this was so that they could more efficiently invest these newly found funds. There were tax implications, there were liability implications as well, right? And then what we practice today, sort of what successful VC looks like, really emerged after World War II. A guy by the name of George Doiro with American Research and Development Corp. This notion of long tail investing, where you invest something in 10 companies and maybe one or two are the ones that fund the rest. He systematized it, at least that fund, by investing in some of the new tech, right? So Digital Equipment Corporation, if some of you are old enough to remember those guys. And then in the 70s, you had ERISA, which allowed pension funds. So pensions are supposed to be like super safe, but allowed pension funds, institutional investors, essentially invest in venture capital, private equity. And so what we practice today, this financial vehicle, has had a long history and has ended up where it is today, where GPs go out, raise money from LPs. A lot of times they can get institutionals, amazing, and then they look for these entrepreneurs. And so some questions emerge. Some questions emerge as we practice this in growth economies. What should our version of venture capital look like as we invest in these entrepreneurs operating in economies where they don't just have to build products and services, but they have to build the ecosystems? What did venture capital look like back in the day when it was sort of emerging? Right, these are just questions. I'll end with two quotes from two books that I hope you take with you. The first is systems thinking. A lot of what we have to do in growth economies is build systems, create systems. And I love this quote that says, if we understand phenomena, essentially, the rate of change of systems, we don't expect things to happen faster than they can. We don't give up too soon. We don't give up too soon. I'm very fortunate to have 3 children. It would have been super weird if, like, child number 3, after 5 months of pregnancy, I told my wife, like, where is the baby? Oh my gosh. We all know 9 months, give or take. If we understand, realistically, considering the economic climate, considering the ecosystem constraints, how fast should an entrepreneur be able to build a mobility company in X country? I think those are questions that are pretty easy to find out. We can model those. And so as the entrepreneur is building, we can see how they're tracking, and we're basing it off the constraints in their economies. It's a lot of what our research is really trying to uncover to make the work you do a lot more predictable. Because like I said, I think it's the most important thing in development. The last one I'll leave you is a quote from our book. Don't shame me. But in chapter, I think it's chapter 3. I think it's chapter 3 of our book. In The Struggle Lies Opportunity, we say the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. I really, really hope that some of the things that I've said today are helpful. I hope that you have a newfound appreciation for the work you do. USAID was never going to be the one to transform growth markets. the development establishment is just not. It is a lot of the work that happens in this room over the next couple days, at your portcos, at your ICs. That's what's going to transform these economies. So I'm very grateful for all of you. I really am. And I wish you all the best as you continue to help these entrepreneurs build better economies. Thank you.